Let's talk about Yuumi. Yuumi has been a significant problem over the course of her lifetime in League of Legends. Although her concept as a dive enchanter was cool, the sheer amount, diversity, and versatility of output she brought to the table was always overwhelming, leading to her being the first champion intentionally gutted into an unplayable state since the early days of League. Now we're seeing her receive a major identity-shifting update that should hopefully change the way she interacts with the game around her. As usual, I got together with my community to test the new Yuumi, working to develop as much of her playstyle and counterplay as possible pre-release. In this video, we will cover Yuumi's new abilities and ability usage, her new laning dynamics, her purpose and playstyle, her synergies and potential counterpicks, and her runes and itemization. Yuumi's passive comes in two parts, a periodic heal and the friendship mechanic. While her passive is off cooldown, Yuumi's next auto attack gains 50 bonus range, and her next auto or ability hits will heal her. If she is attached or attaches within 4 seconds of her proc, her ally is also healed. Ability hits will not waste the heal if Yuumi and her ally are both at full HP, but the auto will. The friendship mechanic grants permanent friendship stacks to the ally Yuumi is attached to when they kill enemy champions and minions. The ally with the most friendship stacks is considered Yuumi's best friend, with ties broken by most recent attachment. Yuumi's best friend has special interactions with most of Yuumi's abilities. Yuumi's Q is a linear skill shot that can be redirected while in transit. Prowling Projectile is almost the same ability as before, dealing magic damage to the first target hit, revealing them, and slowing them. While attached, you can steer the missile, but after 1 second, when the projectile is empowered with increased damage and a stronger slow, Yuumi loses control and the missile flies directly forwards at increased speed. Unattached Q has no empowered form. If Yuumi is attached to her best friend, Q will always deal its empowered slow, and on striking a champion, the best friend is granted magic damage on hit for 5 seconds, scaling with the best friend's crit chance. Yuumi's W attaches her to an ally, rendering her untargetable. On cast, Yuumi dashes to her target ally, starting W's cooldown on arrival. While attached, she casts all abilities from her ally's position. She can recast W while attached to detach or to dash to another ally. W's cooldown only prevents Yuumi from reattaching during her detached state, not from bouncing between allies or from detaching. Yuumi's dash is knocked down by any immobilizing CC. W is placed on a 5-second cooldown anytime she is immobilized or grounded. Yuumi's W has exactly the same properties as it did before the mid-scope, with one exception. She no longer shares massive amounts of percent adaptive force between herself and her ally. Instead, Yuumi gains heal shield power while attached to her best friend, while the best friend gains some passive on-hit healing. Yuumi's E is a shield that bestows minor buffs. Yuumi cannot target her shield. It is always cast on her ally if she is attached, and on herself if she is not. The shield grants an attack speed steroid for a short duration, and a movement speed steroid for as long as the shield holds. If cast on her attachment, Yuumi restores to them some mana, the value increasing by up to 100% based on her ally's missing mana. Yuumi's R fires 5 waves in a target direction, affecting both allies and enemies. Yuumi can move freely during her channel. If cast while attached, Yuumi can steer the target direction until she detaches. Enemies are damaged and slowed, with subsequent waves dealing heavily reduced damage, but stacking their slow value and refreshing the slow duration. Allied champions are healed by each wave, with excess healing converting into a shield that lasts for 3 seconds, plus the remaining channel duration. Yuumi's best friend is healed for 30% more, and granted bonus resistances that last only for the channel's duration. The way you should cast and interact with Yuumi's spells has changed. As mentioned, Prowling Projectile has significantly more counterplay given Yuumi's reduced ability to curve her skill shot. If an enemy stands in the wave, it should be very difficult to reliably weave a Q inside. Note that if you're going to try to weave, you can only be expected to curve your shot at most 90 degrees. You'll find that you're better off waiting for enemies to isolate themselves from the wave, where it's not that hard to play a mind game with your Q angle and to exploit your incredible range. The consequence is that it's far harder for Yuumi to access her non-ultimate sustain in lane. Her heal is linked to her tiny auto range and to her less reliable Q. Now that her E is a shield instead, Yuumi is very capable of preventing damage in scrappy short trades, but struggles to mitigate heavy poke. But we really aren't reliant on empowered Q anymore. Before, this was necessary to land, as most of the value in the spell was the substantial percent current HP damage. With that gone, the extra damage is kind of a luxury. We're getting our empowered slow and our on-hit damage no matter what if we're on our best friend. Don't be discouraged from landing the weaker Q, as it still grants high value in all chase, trade, or skirmish scenarios. Since the primary purpose of R is survivability, you'll heavily deprioritize offensive casts. We're far less likely to cast our ultimate at the beginning of a fight for a slow than we would for a root. Save it for when your best friend is threatened, as the HP swing is tremendous. If necessary, don't be afraid to cast it out of combat in lane, just to put yourself in a stable position you can use to close out your sequence. Unfortunately, there are fewer reasons to detach on this iteration of Yuumi. Boasting the absolute worst base stats I've ever seen, Yuumi no longer gains any value from entering her lane at level 1, fist fighting down to 1 HP, and attaching to prevent herself from ever being killed. The trade just doesn't go in her favor anymore. Having access to her passive on Q hits means that proccing her passive on auto is less necessary. Now, there are good reasons to detach. It's still worth blocking non-CC skill shots, it's still worth proccing passive when Q is unavailable and the heal is urgent, and it's still worth contributing some auto attack damage when you're committed to a trade in which the enemies cannot CC you and you're out of utility spells. It's just that this incarnation of Yuumi neither has to nor wants to detach regularly, while the old one certainly did. I find it highly likely that we will always prioritize a Q, E, W skill order. Q and E grant the same baseline numbers per rank, but even in anti-engaged situations in which a larger shield would be desirable, I find it hard to argue against the poke spell with a lower CD, lower mana cost, higher slow per rank, and higher potential empowered value. I would prefer to harass the enemy back and to dissuade their engages in the first place. I fear that leveling into a shield bot reduces Yuumi's power during her weakest period. Obviously, W is our least appealing max. Small amounts of on-hit do add up, and sure, the rank 1 and rank 5 values are dramatically different. The rank 5 W actually can benefit from our items and W passive, but it's hard to argue against 30 shielding per rank when that value will be heavily multiplied, especially when much of W's value is level scaling. I will not write off the possibility of Emax games and low damage W second games though, I just expect them to be very, very rare. Yuumi is a hyperscaling enchanter who excels at transforming an ADC into an unstoppably durable hypercarry. Gone are the days in which Yuumi is always incentivized to abandon her lane partner in favor of the nearest bruiser. Instead, she transforms her squishy best friend into the nearest bruiser. God help us all if this champion successfully makes it out of lane phase. She may not be a top lane empowering dive champion anymore, but the degree to which she empowers an ADC is astonishing. I firmly believe that there is only one proper way to deal with Yuumi, and it's to put her best friend in the dirt as soon as possible. Yuumi can and should still bounce between allies in a teamfight, granting shields where necessary and fishing for better ult angles, as long as it's not at the expense of her best friend. When empowering her best friend, Yuumi's output is absolutely obscene. When empowering anyone else though, it's reasonable. So if her best friend is too weak to take advantage of Yuumi's power, she is not stronger than other enchanters. And there's no practical way for Yuumi to prevent her ADC from becoming her best friend, or to easily swap best friends either. The only way to prevent friendship stacks is to stay unattached for every creep farmed during the lane phase, which means you're very likely not contributing. Friendship stacks are gained so quickly while farming that it would take Yuumi an inappropriate amount of time in the side lane on another carry during the mid game to catch up, and there is no hope of a jungler ever catching up without taxing resources. It is a time-consuming task with severe drawbacks to swap your best friend, so Yuumi should always be vulnerable to her ADC being beaten early into irrelevance. Of course, matchups are always up for further testing and are always the least solved part of a day one guide, so take this with a grain of salt, but I strongly suspect the most consistent way to accomplish this lane dominance is with extreme poke lanes. Damage sticks to Yuumi's partner now as long as you're dodging her Qs, and attacking her mana bar by forcing her to shield often is effective. You need to pilot this cleanly though, as Yuumi's lane is very comfortable to go only 10 to 15 CS down. Make sure you're not drafting a support who relies on taking momentary 1v1 short trades, as Yuumi will always prevent those from occurring. You can try to coin flip the game through raw aggression with a melee support, but this will require your jungler to be on board and capable of executing dives before level 6. Otherwise, again, Yuumi's lane will simply accept minor CS loss, and then engaging onto her in the mid game will prove difficult without an abundance of damage behind it. Historically, it has been a good idea to match Yuumi's scaling with a Sona or Soraka. I wouldn't be surprised if this turned out to still be true in the long term, but at least on release date, I think that Yuumi outscales both. Realistically, you have 8 minutes to shut this champion down. You cannot let her unlock her ultimate from an even state. Make your time count and do not give that AD carry away back into the game. As the Yuumi lane, you always have inevitability on your side. Yuumi's kit tells us that she needs an auto attacker as her best friend. Her kit is full of offensive steroids that benefit only auto attackers. So what partners do we value? The usual suspects of Zeri and Sivir remain very strong Yuumi partners, but Nilah is the one who will truly break this champion. If Nilah Yuumi make it out of lane in a remotely playable Nilah game, they win. Yuumi's heal shield power is a level scaling effect on a champion with increased XP. Nilah's passive grants Yuumi effectively an extra forbidden idol. Yuumi's extra combat sums create more ghost flash angles for Nilah, her empowered slow fully solves Nilah's stickiness issues. There is synergy between every aspect of their kits. Nilah will never die. And since Yuumi is a proper protective enchanter now, it's legitimate to play her alongside on-hit Varus, Kog'Maw, Aphelios, and Twitch. Even the off-tank bully marksmen like Draven or Misfortune could find some potential value with Yuumi despite not being optimal synergy points. Yuumi isn't even that weak in lane. She does enable some devastating trades if her empowered Q lands, though it's on your opponents to get hit in the first place. In a vacuum, it's not hard to find a good Yuumi partner. The only concern is drafting in such a way that your auto attacker can survive the probable hyper poke response if Yuumi is picked very early in the draft. If you can solve this problem, the champion is trivially blind pickable. As a quick note, there was a secretly legitimate top lane Yuumi strategy floating around before. If that were to continue to exist, we could find a bruiser best friend in our jungler, but unfortunately, Yuumi's base stats are just too poor to even dream of surviving an unattached lane phase. In terms of itemization, we start on a standard enchanter itemization base with a Moonstone preference. Whenever I see a champion with built-in heal shield power and the means to trivially stack Moonstone before one big healing bomb, I get very scared of what that champion will do on Moonstone completion. Though I expect Yuumi to be one of the best Moonstone users in the game, you could still build Shurelya's for agency. We tested non-traditional options such as early Ardent Censer with the reasoning that if anything can make this item remotely good, it's a champion who is effectively a walking Ardent Censer. Even that resulted in atrocious output from this item though. Prioritize Redemption or Mikael's over this. Since we're permanently attached, we will not be purchasing boots. A major reason why we're using standard enchanter itemization rather than fully defining principles unique to this champion is that AP Yuumi has died. Losing the reliability of empowered Q as well as a significant damage reduction on R means that on these ratios it's simply not worth building for damage. So to our knowledge, there is nothing that Yuumi does to warp the item system around her. Use your general enchanter principles. I would default to a Sorcery Inspiration rune page. Sorcery for the typical mana, haste, and scaling that most enchanters love. Inspiration because I want to optimize my Moonstone spike and my Summoner spell uptime. I realize that historically, Cosmic has not been the rune of choice for a flashless champion who takes lower CD spells, but this is a different Yuumi. The traditional Precision secondary page of Presence of Mind and Cutdown is still reasonable, but I expect its value to be reduced alongside Yuumi's damage and Q reliability, and the relaxation of her mana costs. Resolve for Revitalize alone honestly could be worthwhile, it's just that the natural partner would be Font of Life, which isn't expected to gain heavy value on the squishiest champion in the game. All of this is to say that I truthfully don't know which secondary page will prove to be the best, but I'm sure it's one of these three candidates. I would prioritize a Haste Shard over AP in our minor runes. So that's the Yuumi midscope, intended to reduce her frustration, strip her of some top-level performance, and to make her a better champion in lower levels of play. By design, sure, this absolutely removes some of the most toxic elements of the old Yuumi, but what we have instead is tuned to be an absolute nightmare. I try not to make power assessments in these videos and focus instead on the lasting theory, but it's just so hard with the cat. Thankfully, several numbers nerfs later, I project a Yuumi more bound to our ADC will be easier to deal with using some of the counterplay described in this video, and thankfully Yuumi is still fun to pilot between her new Q and the preservation of most of her detachment tricks. But in the immediate short term, prepare for some problems. Have fun, Yuumi players! Thank you to my patrons, SonicX5040, Mel7401, Hailfire, and Yanagon. Your continued support makes these videos possible.